They drink her milk. They hold her down. They think it's funny. They think of her as an animal, as you see in their journals, where they're having to make the lists of which parts of Sethe are animal and which parts seem human. So she's definitely dehumanized by school teachers' system of thought. She is stock for school teacher. But there's a much bigger history behind this. Think about the women who were wet nurses. You see sometimes in the movies, black women who are nursing white babies. You'll have a black slave woman, a member of the house help, who seems to experience decent conditions. She works inside the house where it's cool or cooler. She's not out in the field being driven along by a whip. But one of her jobs is to nurse these slave families' babies. Now, I don't know if you've thought about that very much, what that would mean to a mother. Imagine that your mother, part of her job was to go off to someone else's house and give her milk to that person's baby. And maybe you're her baby at home, or in a basket in the master's kitchen, still needing milk yourself. When her work as a nursemaid is done each day, whatever milk she has left, she gives to you and her other children. Imagine that this mother herself is having to find ways to cope with that whole idea that she has this milk, particularly because she's had a baby, and that's why her body developed the milk, but she has to give it away to someone else. She doesn't own the milk. She doesn't own her own body. And even her child doesn't have first dibs on the milk. In the novel, Nan was the woman who fed Sethe as a baby because her own mother was out in the rice fields. Sethe barely knew her own mother, and Nan was only able to feed her own children and Sethe after she feeds the white babies. So she's kind of like a dairy cow. I mean, she's being kept much like a dairy cow. Slave owners sometimes expressed that a woman would foal, meaning that she would have a baby. That's the word that school teacher would use to express that she's going to have a child, and it will increase the stock. It's like a cow having a baby. When Sethe escapes, school teacher wants to capture Sethe because of her own value, but also because she's pregnant and she's worth double because she's got another person or another slave inside her. Now, neighbors criticize Garner for spoiling his slaves, treating them like human beings. But does he treat them as fully human? Paul D. asks himself this question. Were they really human or not, he and his brothers? Garner told them they were human, but Paul D. wonders, were they human because Garner said they were human? Garner gets to name them. He gets to say whether they're human or not. He did treat them relatively well, but when he died, they were left to the mercies of the other people around them. So they didn't have any true liberty at all. One historical fact that disturbs us now is that some slave owners had sexual relations with their slaves, increasing their stock by the resulting pregnancies. Morrison explores the mindset of slavery here. Slaves were not legally counted as human beings. They were called chattel. When you look at historic documents, such as an inventory of the assets on a plantation, you'll see slaves described under the category of chattel. And that's part of the list of things that are part of the estate. What's interesting is a lot of the slaves were actually children of the slave owner. But there was a law that said that the child must follow the condition of the mother. Well, that's an interesting choice. Why wouldn't the child follow the condition of the father? In other words, the law would apply to the child that applied to the mother, not the law that applies to the father. We know very few historical cases of a black man fathering a child with a white woman. It may have happened, but we don't have many records of that development. But there were many, many cases of a white man fathering a child with a black woman, with one of his slaves. Frederick Douglass describes in his narrative, his slave narrative, that often the children that were produced by that relationship, by the slave owner and a female slave, those children would often be sold off very quickly after their birth, because the master's wife knew that these children were basically her children's half-siblings, and it would cause a lot of problems within the family. So the master would sell those children off quickly, get the money for them, and restore some semblance of peace to his household. Morrison's point with this extended investigation of slaves as either animals or human is a really important one to the novel. She emphasizes the really weird contradiction in the notion that the slave was stock. Would slave owners have participated in producing something that was half cow, half human? Probably not. And furthermore, we understand scientifically it can't be done because they're two different species, which is proof that genetically slaves were human. But the South went on treating them legally as stock. Remember the story of Stamp Pade's wife? She was called by the master's son for his sexual pleasure, and she just had to go, right? Stamp had to let her go whenever the master would call for her for sex. And Stamp didn't kill the man. And he says now that this was his way of balancing out the ledger. He might have stolen from the master by escaping and helping other people escape, but whatever debts that this behavior created were paid for by his choosing not to kill the man that used his wife that way. Now, this deal that he makes, really in his own head, but he sort of makes this deal with the universe. This deal reveals the complicated legal, economic, moral arrangement that was created by slavery. Paul D. grapples with this conundrum too, recognizing that his worth is measurable by school teacher and is based on how much he can enhance the wealth of the plantation. He's really, in a way, treated like a workhorse. So he's always wondering if he's fully human. Another important question, so I'm moving on to another question here. Why did Morrison tell the story this way, even though it's confusing? So she does not tell this in a linear way, does she? And it is confusing. There are times when you are wondering, did this episode come before that episode? Are we in the present? Are we in the past? If we're in the past, which part of the past are we in? Morrison does this to us because she's replicating how your mind works when it's dealing with the traumatic past. Even for a relatively healthy person with what we might think of as a normal memory, we don't think through our memories in a really strict chronological way, right? Maybe you smell something, you smell biscuits cooking, and suddenly you're back in your grandmother's kitchen and you're remembering all the details of where the coffee pot sat, what your grandfather would be doing as he sat at the table. You remember all kinds of details and feelings associated with that little fragment of a memory. Sometimes, though, you don't remember the whole thing. And psychologists say that around trauma, our brains become very selective. We can only remember little bits and pieces, maybe, of those things. The brain is amazing at helping us cope. If something is traumatic enough, your brain may literally block out some of the parts of it that keep you from being able to function. But those memories are not really gone. They're still in there. Your brain knows those things. So the past sometimes sort of unexpectedly invades the present. Sometimes it just comes back to you, even though you don't want it to come back to you. And it often comes in snatches. Sometimes you can't even grab onto the whole memory, right? You can only grab a little piece of it, and sometimes you feel very unresolved because of that. So Morrison's narrative strategies are put in place to help us kind of relive that experience. Now, my last question is, what does this novel say about how we might better balance general welfare with liberty? The U.S. Preamble promises both general welfare and liberty, but those two things are often difficult to balance with one another. You might be thinking, well, during slavery we had neither. There was a whole segment of the population that didn't have liberty and whose general welfare was not being provided for. You had a whole class of people who were not included under the protection of the Constitution. But I want to think about what this book can tell us about where we are today with that question, and why Morrison may want us to revisit some of those themes. One might argue, and I'm sure many people did at the time, that's one reason we had a civil war, that the U.S. slavery system enabled a strong economy, which is part of the general welfare, right? In order to give up slavery, the country would have to suffer economically, at least temporarily. That economy, that slave economy, made it possible to feed the majority. You might compare that to today's situation with migrant workers. Today we grapple with questions like, should employers be penalized heavily for hiring undocumented workers, even if that would drive up prices for American consumers? Or should undocumented workers be guaranteed minimum wage and labor protections under the law, even if it means the cost of produce or carpet or other products would be driven up as a result? Most migrant workers who become sick from exposure to pesticides, for example, won't sue their company because the repercussions are just too dire for them. Whereas a U.S. citizen would sue, driving up prices in the long run by doing so. So it's not that unusual for us to justify something based on economics, right? Perhaps we don't really want to dehumanize people most of the time, but we're challenged with trying to balance fair treatment of U.S. residents against survival of whom? The majority? The dominant culture? Initially, engaging in slavery enabled European immigrants, or we now call them maybe European Americans, to build power among countries that at the time were vying for territory and wealth. And by exploiting particular groups, the U.S. built a foothold and eventually a great deal of wealth and power. Yet, without basic humanity guaranteed to every person living here, without equal distribution of general welfare and liberty, can we even claim to be the United States of America, the definition of which is articulated in our founding documents? Can we honestly say that we are what we say we are? And perhaps more importantly, can we sustain our own humanity if we are willing to compromise the humanity of another person for our own benefit? The novel is so powerful partly because it raises such fascinating and perplexing questions. I encourage you to read it again at some point. If you do, I think you'll find yourself making new connections and discovering new insights now that you know the whole story and you can reread it with this discussion in mind. Thanks for listening. It's been great fun exploring Toni Morrison's Beloved with you.